Today, no get out of jail card yet. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to the latest post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today I'm joined for our Friday afternoon chat with Tarek Brooker. Hi Tarek.
G'day Martin, how are you?
I'm pretty good. How's the world of journalism treating you?
Yeah, not too bad actually. You know, I've actually been pretty popular with news.com, so I can't really complain too much.
That's very good. Well, you can't say there's nothing to write about.
There's certainly a lot to write about, whether it's, the Russians amassing their army at the borders of the Ukraine, the Chinese invading the Taiwanese air defense identification zone, or whether it's about, financial markets and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, so it's a good, interesting question where to start. But, the financial stability report came out from the Reserve Bank today. And essentially it said everything's fine. We're just keeping an eye on house prices and credit. But, the Council of Financial Regulators thinks it's all great. The banks are well capitalised. Nothing to see here. Move on.
I think that's something that we sort of really, in some ways, need to get into, because it's all well and good for them to look at these big aggregate average numbers. But as you always say, the averages mask the reality of the situation. Now, if you look at something, say, like the RBA's credit aggregate data, you're seeing the fact that households are still overwhelmingly paying down debt, while other households are taking on shed loads more debt. So in aggregate, the RBA and APRA are saying, oh, well, things aren't too bad. It's not that big of a deal. But what's happening is that you're seeing younger households saddled with larger and larger and larger debts. And as you showed me on Twitter the other day, the bank of mum and dad coming to the rescue with nearly 100 grand a pop, but by the same token, then you've got the older demographics who are all paying down debt. So, it's really quite, it's quite opaque.
Yeah.
In terms of the averages.
And look, the point is averages absolutely mask even more than before. And remember that APRA only looks at the averages, right? APRA takes aggregate reported data out of the banks and basically says everything's fine. The banks actually in their own portfolios tend to be looking at aggregated data, right? There aren't many people who are actually down in the weeds looking at individual households and what they're doing. But as soon as you do that, then you absolutely see two things. Firstly, a lot of people still paying down debt because a lot of people are still concerned about their own situation and what may be ahead. But first-time buyers, the average first-time buyer loan is 20% bigger than it was this time last year. And the average loan-to-income ratio for a first-time buyer is 6, 7 or 8 times. Now, just that data would underscore that there are risks that there weren't around a year ago, and yet the Reserve Bank and APRA say there's nothing to see here.
Well, it's quite funny when you think about it. If you look at, say, for example, you mentioned the debt to income ratios. If you look at that from, say, a UK or an American perspective, you'd get laughed out of the bank. In the UK, 90% of loans written have to be below 4.5 times debt to income.
Yep.
Yet here in Australia, it's just like, doesn't matter. You want 6 times, you want 7 times. There was a few things in the media, both recently and earlier last year, where they said, "Oh, but we're capping our debt to income ratios at 7 and 8 times," and the rest of the world must just be looking at us and going, "What are you doing?"
Well, yes, and of course the old argument goes like this: doesn't matter because repayments are really, really low because rates are really, really low, right? Except the size of the loan is really, really big. So your net payment actually hasn't really changed very much at all. And in fact, in some cases, it's still higher. And of course, the thing that we also want to underscore here is that those people who are committing to those big mortgages with very low rates may be in for a bit of a shock should rates start to move up sooner than some expect.
Agreed. And it's funny because you're talking about something that you're committing to for 30 years. 30 years is a very, very, very long time. So for example, you think about a couple of years ago, 30 years prior to that, we thought the Soviet Union would last forever. We thought that the Cold War would go on and on and on. If you look at, Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek, even in like the 23rd century, they talked about, how the Soviet Union still existed, so it's really hard to look at something over that sort of timeline and be able to say, oh, everything's going to be fine and everything's going to stay the same, because that level of hubris has got us into trouble once before. I mean, after World War II and up until probably the sort of the mid 1960s, inflation was on a relatively downward path. Central bankers once again had the same level of hubris, and they believed we've beaten inflation for good. It's never ever coming back. And well, hey presto, then the late 1960s, early 1970s happened, and then all of a sudden inflation went through the roof, and completely changed everything.
Yes, and of course the scenario is perhaps a bit different because we're not seeing any wages growth at the moment, and the Reserve Bank is saying no wages growth for the next 3 or 4 years, right? Which, by the way, is another reason that the get out of jail card isn't there, because if you look at the early 2000s, a lot of people borrowed big, but their incomes grew a lot faster than the commitments on the mortgage. So they effectively got out of jail thanks to wages growth. But there's none of that this time around. So people who are making those commitments, as you say, for a long period of time, are making it against the backcloth of rising costs of living, possibly, but no wages growth.
Indeed, and I think that's something that you covered quite well with Steve from CanStar the other day in your chat with him, that that this isn't a forever situation, that rates will eventually rise one day. I mean, Harry Dent makes a good argument that they're going to rise later this decade as a result of changing demographics and the millennials hitting that peak income earning age and that peak household formation age. And he makes a very good point. I mean, personally, I don't know exactly how that's going to function when you talk about the enormous quantum of debt that's ongoing, but you can't rule it out. I mean, in this current situation, you can't rule out pretty much anything. I mean, as tensions escalate, say, for example, between the US and China over Taiwan, you could see all sorts of, supply chain reshoring. You could see, regionalizing of supply chains, and all these things are inflationary, because we're no longer going to be paying the Chinese however many dollars or cents an hour to make our goods on the cheap. They're going to be sent elsewhere. And even if you're just moving a factory, that costs money. And not only that, but the developing world that has the skills to make the types of high-tech products that we want command higher wages than they once did.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And, it's fascinating. Of course, central banks around the world are saying, we can't see any sign of inflation. In fact, if there is any inflation, it's only going to be very, very short term. It'll be blippish because of, just adjustments rather than it being structural. And yet there are definitely a number of arguments where you can begin to make a point that there could be some fundamental structural inflation beginning to emerge in some areas, but not wages. And so that's why it's really complicated to try and figure out whether, in fact, inflation is a real monster or just a fey monster that basically people are putting up to justify particular stances in terms of investments, or indeed particular product sales, which there's a lot of that going on at the moment.
There is. And I think inflation is a fascinating sort of subject, because we live in this very, very strange world where, on one hand, if rates stay low, we can justify all sorts of multiples and for asset prices, for stocks, Bitcoin to the moon, whatever it is. All those narratives are relatively common. But if rates rise and you do start to see, relatively high levels of returns, high levels from where we are, say, a 2.5-3% on a 10-year bond, that type of thing. We have no idea what that's going to do to asset valuations and to the broader economy. And by the same token, it's just like, well, what happens? What's going to happen if rates do rise to that level? And there are predictions out there from mainstream forecasters that will occur in the coming weeks, months, and years. And you just got to say to yourself, well, one, that's going to impact the housing market, because if long end rates rise that significantly, it's going to start pushing up the short end of the curve at some point too. But then there's also the broader question of, can the economy as a whole take rising rates? And there's a lot of people who think it doesn't look too good.
Well, it's a very point you make there. And of course, the RBA's ratio between debt and income is now above 180 again. So it dropped a little bit, but it's now up again. But that information, of course, looking at households, is completely inaccurate, because it actually is aggregated across all households, and yet only a third of households actually borrow, right? So you have to divide that by, three times. In other words, it's closer to 6 times rather than 1.8 times. And what that tells me is that there are going to be considerable pain exerted on a proportion of the population if in fact rates go in a particular direction, and therefore costs go up, and therefore the costs of debt goes up. And again, it goes back to what you said at the beginning. This is granularity. You have to get granular. You have to understand that there's a big difference between the aggregate information, which may or may not look okay, and what could happen on the ground amongst individual households.
Indeed, and that's something that we're going to see with the conclusion of JobKeeper as well, because it's all well and good to say, oh well, this is how much retail's doing, this is how much this particular element of the economy is growing, but it's all well and good that people are going out and buying themselves a brand new Mercedes, but that's not really going to help people who are in areas of, say, Melbourne, that have suffered the most from lockdowns and are suffering significantly as all this government's support is withdrawn. And just while we're on the topic of the debt ratios and stuff like that, you often see Australia compared with the US and Canada and the rest of the Anglosphere, and how, off the charts we are. It's actually even worse than that, because in the US, a sizable proportion of total household debt is student loans and auto loans. And in Australia, it's not, because HEX is relatively inexpensive compared to US student loan repayments, and Australians take on far less debt when they buy cars. Well, in America, a new car in the driveway is just one of their, cultural affinities. So in actual fact, Australia's debt to income ratio is even worse, because all of the debt, well, not all of the debt, that's obviously an exaggeration, but a lot more of the debt is concentrated within those mortgage borrowers rather than spread across a wide range of demographics.
Now, that's a very important point, of course. And, to underscore the point again, our reliance on the household debt pool pointing specifically at housing, both for living in and also for investment, is higher than anywhere else in the world. The proportion of investors are higher than pretty much anywhere, and the overall debt ratios are higher than anywhere. So we are very, very exposed to property. No wonder that the Reserve Bank and the Council of Financial Regulators were so keen to try and keep prices high, because, of course, if prices had started to slide, that would have put huge pressure on households' balance sheets, and it would also put huge pressure on the banks as well.
Indeed, it's hard to just look at this and see how it's all going to be justified in the long term. It's like, okay, so we've had this enormous crisis. We've got shed loads of debt, more than anyone else nearly more than anyone else in the world, depending on what's your chosen measure, more than pretty much any other time in human history. And rather than just take our medicine, deal with the asset price decreases and just get on with it, we've decided to blow an enormous bubble on top.
Well, it's a bubble on a bubble. I don't know what is that bubble squared, or is that, I don't know what you call a bubble on a bubble.
In a way, it's a bubble on a bubble on a bubble on a bubble, because you've got the Aussie bubble, the current bubble, on top of the housing bubble,
yep,
on top of the Chinese bubble, on top of the well, then you've got the Chinese property bubble, on top of the China bubble, which is an enormous debt-fueled economy.
Yeah, I think it's just a house of cards. That basically is what we're saying, right? It's all built on the same sort of debt basis. I don't know whether you saw Adam Crichton. He's now over in the US, but he actually wrote a very interesting comparative piece looking at the IMF report that basically said, look, things are a bit better than we thought. But he made the point that the acceleration of debt in Australia is more dramatic than anywhere else around the world.
I hadn't seen that, but by the same token, it doesn't surprise me.
No, it's pretty interesting. I'll put a link to the to the particular example. But public debt, huge, right? We went from zero debt to 1 trillion plus. Private debt still going up. And by the way, just while you're at it, personal credit is also on the turn now. There's a spike in credit card debt starting, because now with JobKeeper and JobSeeker going away, guess what? People are having to use their credit cards.
No, I can only imagine that these type of folks have already exhausted their welcome with Afterpay, perhaps.
Well, yes, Afterpay. Now, interesting there, of course, with the regulation in the UK, and now the sort of more subtle regulation here, self-regulation. Well, of course, we're going to be very careful about who we advance money to. But of course, the reason that Afterpay share price has dropped is more to do with the way that tech companies are valued, right? Because essentially it's all about future earnings. And if in fact rates are going to be higher in the future, it means that earnings are worth less today.
I just look at the world, and it's such a complex beast, perhaps more than any time, probably since the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union, because everything is just sort of up in the air because you don't know what's going to happen. You've got Joe Biden coming out and pledging the United States, and I quote, unwavering support to the Ukraine in the event of conflict with Russia. And you can't help but look at that and go, well, what does that actually mean? That sounds rather ambiguous. Does that mean that we're going to send the kitchen sink and we're going to help you, or we're going to send you a nice little letter saying, best of luck, guys.
Yes.
I hope you do well against Yuri.
Yes, you have our unwavering support.
Exactly.
Have a letter.
Well, it's the diplomatic way of the 20th century, and it's a similar story across the Taiwan Strait. You've got people who know much more about this, who've been studying it longer than I've been alive, who are warning about brewing conflicts and all these sorts of things. And I just feel like saying, it's like all of these things are on the table. I'm not saying that they are going to happen, but they are on the table. And then there's obviously everything with the virus, which is still going on in the rest of the world. And, there's concerns about vaccine-resistant strains and, the whole narrative of Wall Street saying that everything's going to be great, and that could all just, blow up in their faces.
Well, let's just finish off on the international relations before we get on to the virus. But one of the things I've been looking at is the closer association between Russia and China. A lot of this has gone under the radar, but they do seem to be dancing a somewhat more similar tune these days.
I've been banging on about this for about 4 years now in print, and it's such just a silly mistake by the Americans to antagonize the Russians at this time. Now, I'm not saying that Vladimir Putin is a good guy or that what Russia is doing is right, but that's not the way the world works. I mean, there's a reason why Nixon went to China to divide the communist bloc. And what we need is something similar right now, is to ensure that China and Russia aren't pushed together into a marriage of convenience, into a situation where the West is in serious trouble, in a potential conflict that we may not be able to win. Because the idea that the US could fight a conflict in Europe and against China over Taiwan at the same time is just it's a Pentagon military planner's nightmare. And I think that there really needs to be a rethink, not only in the US but elsewhere, to recognize that the world has changed. The world was already changing prior to COVID, but now that COVID's happened, you've got all these, 134 million people have fallen out of the middle class in the developing world. They've been absolutely hit like a truck. And it's all well and good for all these people in the West to wave their flags on CNN and say the pandemic is over, everything's going to be great, the world economy is going to recover. But that's not the way it is in the vast majority of the world. They're suffering. They're suffering badly, from a lack of tourism, from a lack of jobs, from high unemployment, from all these different things that basically lead me to believe that in a lot of ways, this decade is going to be a rerun of the 1930s.
Well, there are certainly some very worrying signs, and it's interesting to reflect on this. I don't know whether you saw it, but Stan Grant, the ABC Stan Grant, did a very interesting article some time ago highlighting the fact that the Western democracy, that sort of thread is actually now the minority. Actually, if you count it up all around the world, the Western democracy is less than 50%.
And to be honest, it's probably only going to decline further in time, because when these types of events happen, historically speaking, you see the rise of dictatorships. You see, because it's very, very difficult for a democracy where it has to satisfy a whole bunch of different players. There's the people who support the power structure. There's industry. There's all these different people who all want a slice of the pie, and that's very, very difficult to do in a period of economic upheaval. which is why you see dictatorships come out of nowhere, because they promise that they're going to be able to solve those problems. Because it's well, one, they usually they don't end up solving the problem. Mussolini and Hitler showed that. But by the same token, the promise of something better is powerful. And to sort of revisit something that we've hit on quite a few times, I think that it's really, really easy to look at a place like late 1920s Japan or 1920s Germany and see them as these places on the road to a totalitarian regime, when in actual fact they weren't like that at the time. That it was the economic upheaval, the unemployment in Japan, the starving people and the hunger that drove them to do those things, to change their societies, to make them even more militaristic and more expansionistic than they already were. And those are the signs that we need to watch out for now. And as all the stimulus finally comes away in the next couple of years, when it ends, I don't know. I'm not going to pretend to know. There's ideas in the US that we should just do another $10 trillion and just, stuff it. We'll just do what we like. But, I think that, sort of these geopolitical tensions and these problems in these non-Western nations are just going to grow more frequent and more concerning as time goes on.
Well, I think that's exactly my concern too. And we do seem to be on the back foot rather than on the front foot. And one of the things I'd make about dictatorships is they control the message, and they basically are able to portray a particular doctrinal position without worrying about democracy and worrying about opposition and things like that, which gives them a quasi strength that Western democracies often struggle to deal with.
Well, exactly. That's exactly what happened historically. If you look at, say, let's say 1933, 1934 US, and then you compare that to how people viewed, even Westerners, in things like Life magazine or Time magazine, compared their societies with, say, Stalin's USSR or Hitler's Nazi Germany. People literally looked at these great engineering feats that were built with slave labor, and where thousands and thousands of people died in the Soviet Union, and they looked at it and they thought, wow, this is fantastic. They had no idea what was going on, but because this dictatorship that, as you say, that controlled the message, that was able to create this very, very, what would you call it, just this very skillful narrative, it made people believe that type of government was the right thing. You saw it with the rise of fascism, even in places like Britain, even in places like America, that Smedley Butler covers this nicely. And you see the rise of these things because people think, well, if democracy can't solve it, what can?
Absolutely. People are looking for an alternative. And if the alternative narrative sounds more compelling, particularly if there's a lot of pressure on people, then they might well drift towards it. Now, talking about pressure on people, we should touch on the vaccine, the virus. In fact, I did a post yesterday before the announcement yesterday evening, which highlighted the fact that there are now 3 variants from different corners of the world, all looking really, really worrying. One from Brazil, one from the UK, and a couple of others as well. The Conversation article that I referred to highlighted the fact that we could be running quite fast with the vaccines, but not fast enough. And then, blow me, we get the announcement from ScoMo last evening.
Yeah, I think that that this year, in terms of opening the borders, is probably a write-off at this point. They're talking about us receiving the additional 20 million Pfizer vaccine doses around sometime in Q4. But with this vaccine rollout, I'm not really holding my breath, to be completely honest with you. But I think it just speaks to the broader issue in the world as a whole, because it's all well and good for us in the West. Eventually, we're going to get the Pfizer vaccine, and so far the data suggests that it's quite good at countering some of these other strains of the virus. Israel has had issues with, has seen the South African strain, it's seen the UK strain, and it's dealt with it remarkably well. However, then you've got places like Chile, which has one of the highest vaccination rates in the world, somewhere around about 35 to 40%. Yet the number of cases is skyrocketing. And there's, I mean, I can't say anything definitively, but there is speculation amongst experts that the Chinese vaccine is not doing the trick against the Brazilian variant of the virus, which some believe is far more contagious and is currently taking hold in places like Canada. So then that begs the question: all these countries around the world that have been vaccinated with the Chinese and Russian vaccines, which is great swaths of the developing world, are all now potentially in trouble because the vaccine may not be effective against the Brazilian or the South African strain of the virus. And, you know, I it kind of annoys me the way that we have this very Western-centric narrative around surrounding the virus. It's all well and good to say, okay, well, Australia's going to be okay once we vaccinate everyone with Pfizer, and that's what the evidence says so far. And it's very similar for the US and probably, you know, a relatively similar story for Europe in time. But unlike, you know, most of the last 150 years, the rest of the world matters to the global economy. You know, I mean, I like to say Somchai, the motorcycle taxi driver from Bangkok, matters, because if he's not spending, then the people in that economy aren't spending, and that just runs through the entire developing world. And in a lot of ways, it's a perfect reverse of how the Great Depression spread back in the late 1920s and the early 1930s.
Well, that's right. And, you know, the IMF has made the comment a few times, and the World Health Organization also, that, you know, the virus is not going to be over until it's over everywhere. You know, you can't just say it's over here. You know, it's fixed in Australia, because we are one world, as it were.
Yeah, and not the rest of the world isn't like Australia. They're not just going to slam shut their borders and just, you know, live in splendid isolation. You know, trade is going to continue. The free movement of people is going to continue, and you know that there are concerns that the virus could continue to mutate and spread in the developing world for years and years to come. And if the theories about it being, you know, escaping from a lab, which are now being shared by even, you know, senior members of the US CDC, or should I say former members of the CDC, and, you know, quite a few prominent experts, I mean, there really does beg a question that, well, how effective is the vaccine going to be in 5 years? Or 2 years, or even towards the end of the year when we finally get those Pfizer doses in Q4, is it still going to be effective then, or is it all just going to be this, you know, crazy merry-go-round that just keeps going on and on?
Well, that's of course the point, and it's worth, I think, making the point that the latest variants of the virus have come from areas where they failed to control the virus on the first round, right? So the UK, for example, you know, good example. Brazil, a good example, right? There's an object lesson there about if you actually don't get it under control quickly, then you've got much more chance of variations happening and those variants potentially being more lethal.
That seems to be the case, and there are concerns amongst, you know, some experts that the slow vaccine rollouts could also create conditions that are prime for the virus to become vaccine resistant in some of these countries that are struggling with the logistics of the vaccine rollouts. And I mean, I'm not going to profess to know how all this works, how all this is going to turn out, because I'm not an expert. You know, I've done a fair bit of reading, but, you know, these people have devoted their lives to it. Mm. But I think that it's really important to keep in mind that these are outcomes that could occur, that in some people's views they're even likely. And I mean, you know, personally, I've packed away my suitcase and my beach towel for my overseas trips for quite some time to come. And you know, I haven't really changed my opinion on that since last year. I think it's going to be quite a while before we see the world return to normal.
Mm. Well, it's an interesting dilemma. I've got to, well, in theory, I should be renewing my passport about now, right? And the question is it worth it? Maybe I should just wait, right? Save the money for a year or two.
Yeah, well, you just don't know. And honestly, I think that's something that really gets me about the commentary here in Australia, when it's at times quite unrealistic. Like every now and then, probably every month or two, someone in the government will come out with some you know, sort of rough statement saying, oh, we're going to have this travel bubble with Singapore, or we're going to reopen the borders at X time or Y time. And then you'll have someone like the Singapore Prime Minister come out and say, no, next year. None of this mid-year Q3 stuff. No, next year. And it's unrealistic. And I don't know. I sort of, I don't know if it's just, my interest in history sort of clouding my judgment. It could be. But I just feel like we just need a more sort of World War II-esque approach where you just say to people, this is the situation. This is what may happen. This is what, things might go better. Things might go worse. We don't know. But you should be prepared for both outcomes. But instead, we've got the government telling us to go out there and spend all our money.
Well, I did a show yesterday saying we should keep an eye on the downside scenarios too, and hope for the best, but also plan for the worst, right? Because there are too many uncertainties to be absolutely sure at the moment. But I also have this theory, and I don't know what you think about this, that in a way, ScoMo could use this as a get out of jail card, because basically they were clearly failing with their vaccine rollout. Now they've got an excuse.
I think it's going to be a relative win for him, to be completely honest with you. He was really starting to feel the heat, even from some conservative media commentators. People were starting to get very, very angry, very, very frustrated, especially the ones who really want to get overseas to see friends and family, or maybe go for a holiday. And now, all of a sudden, he could just go, well, look, I'm really sorry. You all would have been vaccinated, on our previous timeline, but it's just this whole AstraZeneca thing, and that was completely unforeseen. And he's a master of spin. You can't take that away from him. And just while we're on the topic of politics and the election, the upcoming election, whenever that may end up being, I think it's going to be very, very interesting, because this is all going to take place in the shadow of the pandemic, and more than that, with the pandemic still potentially on the cards to impact Australia for the yet another hotel quarantine breach. I pray and hope not, but it's happened. I've lost count, to be completely honest, how many times it's happened now. But you got to think that there's going to be a lot of early votes, a lot of early votes, pre-polls, a lot of postal votes, and I think that we could see this really strange election where who's winning in the polls may matter a lot more than who's actually winning in the polls when the election day comes, because so many people are going to choose to vote early to just get it out of the way, just in case there's a lockdown or whatever it is, and they just want to get it over with.
Well, and I think you'd agree with me that it's more likely now to be next year rather than this year, right? The election.
Honestly, I don't know. I mean, not long ago, you could get very good odds on that from Sportsbet. I've got to say, you could have got nearly 4-1 odds, Martin. You could have made a nice little, nice little earner on the side. But I'm really not sure. I think it really just depends on what the rest of the world looks like. And in a lot of ways, in some ways, I think that they would probably benefit from going this year, because you don't have the impact of what the world economy looks like next year. But at the same time, next year, at that time, then they're actually going to be held accountable for the vaccine rollout.
Right.
If all these doses do turn up in Q4, and we have the normal election in sort of April or May, as is officially scheduled as the latest possible dates for an election, I think that they could really potentially suffer. And I don't know. I mean, I feel like the longer this all goes on, the more the sheen starts to come off Morrison, to be honest with you.
The analogy I've got is it's quite a large vehicle with many wheels, but the odd wheel seems to be dropping off at various corners at the moment, right? So the question is, how far do you continue to drive it before you stop it and run an election and then start it up again, right? That seems to be the dilemma.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's one of those ones where I'm quite happy to say that I really have no idea, because things develop here so quickly. I mean, 6 weeks ago, there was an article from Peter Van Onselen in The Australian saying that the government was electorally invincible, and that basically they were going to have an early election and they were going to smash Labor. But now Labor's all of a sudden in front. Morrison's popularity has taken a bit of a hit, but not as much as you'd think. And I don't know. I mean, part of me thinks if Morrison just throws a few ministers under the bus eventually, shortly before the election, he gives Reynolds and Porter and just, puts them off to the side until after the election, maybe he could win the next election relatively handily in a shorter period than we expect. Because, it's just like with the rest of the entire world, whether it's, geopolitics or economics, It's all up in the air.
And talk about up in the air. I was interested listening to Labour and their, reaction to the latest news relating to the vaccines. And basically, their argument is, well, we told you so. You should have done more earlier on. That's a bit of a shallow position to take, though, in my view.
It is, and honestly, I think it's a bit of a mistake. To be honest with you, I don't think there's any real political mileage in it. I think that it'll be great for the Labor faithful, and they'll all go, yeah, we all knew that ScoMo was going to stuff this up. But I think it's going to seem a little bit like kicking the country when it's down. And I mean, whether or not pausing should I say cancelling the AstraZeneca vaccine for people under 50 was the right decision or not, from a medical perspective, that's still being debated, by experts. But it's given them remarkable political cover. They can just now say, well, look, let's just take it back to the beginning with the vaccine, issue with the government. Labor criticises them, and let's say Labor decides to make this a key cornerstone of their election campaign, which they really shouldn't, and I hope they're listening, because that would be a silly move. ScoMo would turn around and he would say, we bet on AstraZeneca, and we bet on that particular vaccine because the mRNA-based vaccines like Moderna and Pfizer were completely untested and unproven at the time we made the order, and we did that in the interest of the Australian people. And that's what I'd say if I was a Liberal strategist. Then I'd turn around and say, we bet on Australia. We bet on the University of Queensland vaccine. We agreed to buy millions and millions of doses, and we were trying to support Australian industry, Australian technology, and Australian jobs. And then that they turn around and they'd say that, and then Labor would go, oh shit, we made a really big mistake here. Whoops. But that's the way it is. It's very, very easy to spin it in a really positive way for the government and for the country, and turn it around on Labor, like them kicking Australia when it's down. Labor could say, oh, well, you should have bought more Pfizer, and they'd be like, well, we didn't want to do that. We wanted to bet on Australia. You should want to bet on Australia. Why are you not betting on Australia? And it's very, very easy to turn it around on Labor and make their life a misery with it. But that's what they're doing. I mean, I don't know. Call me Labor. I don't take sides, and I'm pretty inexpensive relative to some of the other consultants you pay.
Yeah, good point. And look, the last thing I wanted to touch on briefly, I think we should, is this whole issue relating to Greensill and the local steel businesses and Gupta and all those things, because there's a really interesting story here of the consequence of global versus local. And the analogy I used when I did an interview the other day on Radio Awara was, it's like Russian dolls, right? You've got the local steel businesses wrapped around the local alliance, wrapped around the global alliance, connected to Greensill, who's connected to Credit Suisse, who, by the way, the bondholders are actually Citigroup, who are now actually creating. I mean, the whole thing is a complete spaghetti, right? But it's a fantastic case study of the complexity of international finance at the moment, and how, particularly if you've got private sector businesses, running the roost, as it were, there's very little disclosure, very little control.
It's really it sort of reminds me of the way things worked around the GFC. The way they just packaged all these dodgy loans into these CDOs, and then they sold them all off as AAA. It's a sort of similar sort of vibe to the thing, and I think really it just goes to show how much you really do need some sort of, it's like what you and Robbie talk about on a regular basis. A national bank to invest in industry. To be able to ensure that when the storm clouds do arrive on the horizon, that there are other options for these companies and these things to fall back on. Because Greensill is absolutely, it's imploding around the world. There's all these businesses in trouble as a result. I can't even imagine how many jobs are at risk around the world if they do completely go under and everything completely falls to bits. And not only that, but you've really got to wonder how many other Greensills are there out there. Especially if we do see some sort of financial market implosion from Bill Huang's, big leveraged 500% bets.
Well, yeah, Archegos and Greensill, are archetypal examples of the latest iteration of non-transparent businesses doing things that are actually skating close to the edge at very least. But you're right, it has resonances around the global financial crisis. But the real question, as you say, is how many more are there out there, and how many more will get caught with all the financial market movements and with all of those things? And by the way, it's also worth noting that the complexity and the structuring that both those organizations used were right out there, right down the risk curve, as it were. But because they were private entities, there were very few controls in place.
Well, I suppose that's just par for the course these days, isn't it? With everything that's going on with Wall Street and with everything else, it's just, with central bankers have created this insane system that just rewards this absurd level of risk taking. If something goes bad, everyone just has a big old cry to the Fed, and I just think that's ridiculous. I know people sort of see me as a bit of a lefty on certain issues and stuff, but Jesus, can we have a little bit of capitalism, please? We've got capitalism for the poor. Can we have capitalism for the rich? If you take risks, it's like with banks, especially here in Australia. There's this idea that no one with bank shares should ever take a bath if the banks go down the gurgler. As far as I'm concerned, if you take the risk and you've got all the dividends for years and years and years and all your franking credits, and then you lose, that's on you. You made a mistake. You made a bet. You pay your money. You take your chances. But that whole thing isn't really there anymore for a lot of the market. And I think that is why we are seeing these, the Bill Hwangs, the Greensills, all these different sort of, well, what can I say without getting sued? Slightly dodgy things that are going on.
Opaque.
Opaque. All these opaque things that are going on around the world, and they're rewarded for this kind of level of risk taking. It's all well and good for us to say now that Bill Hwang and his empire's blown up, and it's kicked Credit Suisse very, very hard, and a bunch of other banks, and made Goldman Sachs even more unpopular than it already is. But by the same token, the guy turned $200 million into $20 billion. If you include all the leverage, he turned $200 million into $100 billion. Now, the lesson that Wall Street and everyone who's going to take away from this isn't don't use 500% leverage. The lesson's going to be, oh crap, we could turn $200 million into $100 billion.
Yep.
Let's get in on that.
Yep. And that's the point, of course, because the story is one of leverage pays most of the time, right? And so the question we've got to ask ourselves is, how many other high leverage positions are there around the world, and how many of those entities are frankly milking it at the moment, whilst ordinary people are really up against it? And it goes back to this disparity between the top end of the town, the big guys, and everybody else that we've touched on before. But the point is that the rules they're playing by are completely different. They are essentially taking risks. Often they don't understand fully the risk they're taking. And when things go wrong, of course, they then go grizzling to central banks and governments for a bailout. So capitalism seems to work one way for some people and another way for everybody else.
Yeah, well, it's like, someone made the point the other day on Twitter that if you spill, some oil down the drain after servicing your car in your driveway, you can get a $10,000 fine. But you can poison the water table for an entire town as a local mining company and only get a fine 4 or 5 times the size. It's like that, only amplified by thousands and thousands of times within the financial system. Look at the financial crisis. They very, very nearly blew up the entire global financial system, and only one middle-level executive ever went to jail, who was basically scapegoated for the entire thing. Actually, I tell a lie. Full credit to the people from Iceland who sent their bankers to jail.
Absolutely. Iceland is the standout, right? Iceland was the one who actually dealt with it, right? Nobody else really did. And by the way, it's worth noting that all of the extra protections that were put in place around the world, they were being unwound now in all sorts of ways. And even the responsible lending obligations in Australia, right, which were brought in after the global financial crisis to protect retail mortgage borrowers in particular, the government wants to unwind those. It's crazy.
Well, anything for the bubble, eh? I mean, it's really been quite instructive, to be honest with you. Looking at everything, the government's really decided that they've just, they want to save the housing market, but they don't really want to pay for it. So they're just like, okay, well, let's get rid of responsible lending laws. Let's let people withdraw money from their supers as part of an emergency, which wasn't actually ended up being an emergency for these people, and they used it as a deposit to buy properties. And now they're talking about formalizing that particular arrangement and, ensuring that the market keeps going higher.
Yep. Well, it's very interesting because, of course, that particular bill was dressed up as a response to COVID and the, economic restructuring, right? So anybody who votes against it is voting against economic restructuring. So that's the first point. The second point is, of course, that it didn't actually get up because the Senate basically said we're not playing ball. It's sort of postponed now until May. And what they're now trying to do behind the scenes is to argue that this is more about enabling SME lending. So basically, the argument now is that you have to pass this bill because it will enable more lending to SMEs, despite the fact that responsible lending was never actually aimed at SMEs in the first place.
I think it's funny that even when the government was willing to wear 50% of the losses with their government-backed loan scheme, even then the banks weren't lending. The responsible lending regulations have absolutely zero to do with it. They've got to do with the way that business loans are weighted for capital requirements, and it's got to do with how the banks assess risk, and how basically if you want a business loan, you damn well better make sure you have a house in a very, very large percentage of cases. And it really does get me just how much they spin these things that are absolute crap. And they put all these things out there, and there's all these think tanks and lobby groups and everyone else who can come up with all these various scenarios and all these various support reports that support whatever cockamamie crap they're coming out with this week, and then people just swallow it. And I just think it's just so stupid because, I mean, there's all these forecasts saying, oh, Australia's going to grow so well, it's going to be fantastic, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, okay, there's still shed loads of stimulus flowing through the economy. People are still saving money. The international borders are, and I will fully admit I got this wrong, the closed international borders are actually benefiting freestanding home prices, and they're benefiting the retail economy because Australians spend more money overseas on travel than people coming to Australia spend on travel. Now, that's not much comfort for people who are in tourism exposed industries, but it's really quite nice comfort for Gerry Harvey.
Who, by the way, got JobKeeper in the first place as well. It's pretty amazing, yeah. Well, I must say that if you stand back and think about it, right, the message really is there's still a lot of water to go under the bridge here before we know where we are, right? And a bit like the analogy of the recent floods, there's a lot of rubbish accumulating around the bridge structures because the tides are rather high, and we're not quite sure how it's going to play out yet.
No, we don't know. And I think, to be honest, just going back to the APRA housing government thing for just a moment, while I remember, I think that's part of why they're pursuing superannuation withdrawals, why they're pursuing getting rid of responsible lending regulations, because they're not sure. There is still fear there that one day all the wheels could just come off, and then all of a sudden, the Australian housing bubble is revealed for exactly what it is. And in a way, that's almost a bad thing. And actually, I am actually partially responsible for that as a part of the media who continues to talk about this as an issue, because it gives the RBA and APRA and the government justification not to step in to address runaway housing prices, because I think there is fear that if they do, they could potentially create conditions that could precipitate a downtrend in housing prices.
Yeah, exactly right. The fact is that we live or die by what happens to housing prices. If they do start to fall, then the feedback loop there, both in terms of confidence and, of course, in terms of bank capital, will be absolutely disastrous because we're so leveraged into housing. On the other hand, if it continues to go up, then housing affordability will continue to deteriorate, unlike some people like Chris Joy, who today said, no, things are fine. Never been better time to buy. Another story for another day, perhaps. But the fact is that we are at a very important inflection point here. But there's a lot of uncertainty, and my own read is that caution is still really, really important. And I sometimes say to people, don't get caught up with all of the one-sided good news that's out there. It's worth counterpointing and counterbalancing it with some perhaps more realistic views, because you're going to be less disappointed.
I think that's really a theme that we've had over the past 12 months. I mean, I can only speak for myself and for my family, but I remember back in sort of February last year, just saying, this is it. This is the way things are. This is the way things are going to be, and I haven't been disappointed. I've been pleasantly surprised at how well we've been able to contain outbreaks.
Yep.
I mean, obviously that I really do feel for the people in Victoria, and they've had a much tougher time than the rest of Australia. But relatively speaking, I've been pleasantly surprised. So that's been quite a positive development for my mental health. But if I kept buying everything the government was selling, every time they said no, the borders are going to reopen, things are going to be fine, things are going to go back to normal. If I bought that every time, I can only imagine how bad I would feel now. Thinking that, oh, hey, it's been over a year since I've seen my mum. I'm going to be able to go see her. And, constantly being told, yes, you can, yes, you can, yes, you can. No, you can't. That would be really, really hard. And I think that's why managing expectations in such a challenging situation that could go on for we don't even know how long is so important.
Absolutely. And, I have to say that some of your brethren in the mainstream media are also, I think, partly responsible for giving the one-eyed story rather than giving the more balanced view. But maybe that's just me being rather grumpy.
I think the thing is that don't get me wrong, there are opinions out there. There are opinion pieces out there. There are commentators out there. I'm one of them. Not on this particular, not on the other side of the debate in this instance. But by the same token, a lot of what the media reports is what we're given by the government. If we say, oh, this is going to reopen, that's going to reopen, it's because we've been told that that's what's going to happen. Now, should we be reporting thought bubbles from the government? Well, you can make up your mind on that, but it's. I don't know. I just think that the government really needs to be a lot more careful with its messaging, because, I mean, perhaps I'm wrong about this. I've been wrong about it so far, but I really do wonder how much rope that the people of Australia are really willing to give the government in terms of them continuing to promise a return to normal that doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation, and my surveys would suggest that that rope is getting at least a little taut.
How so?
Because people's confidence levels, right, and I measure confidence, right, is partly their own situation, but it's also partly the context that they're operating in. And what I'm seeing in my surveys is that people begin to ask deeper questions about, well, hang on, this is what it was meant to be like. This is what it's really like. The gap's growing. And despite the fact that they keep telling us it's fine, it's not. And that is beginning to sort of come through in some of the more recent survey results. So I'll be interested to see how this plays out over the next few weeks.
Well, that's fascinating to hear, and I think that's something that's interesting even from a political perspective, because if people are starting to question the narrative, if they are starting to be a little bit more circumspect about the future, perhaps ScoMo is better going to the polls sooner rather than later, before the worm really starts to turn, so to speak.
Well, it's happened, I think, in about the last 4 to 5 weeks. I've noticed it, and in fact, it came through also in the Brisbane lockdown and the North and New South Wales lockdown. So I've seen it there. So it's subtle, but it's definitely there. So it'll be interesting to watch how this plays out. And I guess as we close out today's chat, the message is somewhat the same, really, which is hope for the best, but plan for the worst.
Well, it comes back to what this old bloke wanted to tell me. I think he said it's the 5 Ps. Prior preparation prevents piss poor performance. Sorry, 6 Ps.
Excellent. Tarek, I appreciate your time today. Thanks very much. Talk again soon.
No worries, mate. Catch you later.
Cheers. Bye.